I think it's been about 10 years since I've seen you, Mayor Bach, when this actually happened. And Cindy, I know there was so much that went on from a communication standpoint. We just wanted to take a few minutes to sit down and talk with you guys about what you remember from the Waldo Canyon Fire and the things that still stick with you today. So, Mayor, I'm gonna let you lead it off. I mean, 10 years ago, this happened. What do you remember? What do you think about when you think back to the Waldo Canyon Fire?
Well, I knew that a fire had started up in the National Forest, which was up in the county outside the city limits. We were told it started on Saturday. We learned later it actually started on a Friday. We knew that for a couple of reasons. One, all 911 calls at that time, wherever they came from, were dispatched through the city, and then we forward those calls where appropriate to the county, and we record all those calls. And someone called a 911 that Saturday morning and said there's a small fire up on Waldo Canyon. If we get somebody up there, I'll wait. So that was on a Friday. Saturday morning, and I've been getting briefings from Cindy and the other senior staff pretty much regularly on what was going on. I then got a call from our emergency management director about 10 o'clock that Saturday morning, and he asked me to get over to West Colorado Avenue, where we had our police and fire commands. We had I think 100 firefighters waiting there in school buses with equipment as well. And we really thought that morning on Saturday that fire would take out Cedar Heights. And honestly, it's really a tribute to those people in Cedar Heights, along with our fire department, for having mitigated a lot of the risk up there with fuel that could have fed that fire. And we did not lose Cedar Heights, thank goodness. But anyway, so the fire went back and forth, and then we evacuated people, half Mountain Shadows on that Saturday, and they get to Tuesday, which is the worst day of it all, the 26th of June, 2012. I had a meeting early that morning along with our senior staff and the National Command Authority, firefighting professionals, weather service, all the regional partners, the state and so forth. We'd had people evacuated for 3 nights, and they were getting a little grumpy, and I don't blame them. They've been on cots down at gymnasiums and wherever they could find a place to rest their heads. And so it was tempting to let people back into Mountain Shadows. We were told that Tuesday morning that the fire was definitely then trending west, really very little concern about it coming back toward the city. It would probably take out Woodland Park. It would continue west toward Divide, north toward Denver. And by the way, if it went north, we couldn't stop it because there are no roads up in there. And I was so tempted to let everybody back into Mountain Shadows without restrictions, because all the experts thought we could do that. They told me that they would be able to give us at least 4 hours advance notice if we had to evacuate again. And fortunately, Cindy and our police chief and our fire chief said, don't do it. Take the political heat, let people back in for half an hour to water plants and to pick up some belongings, but do not let people back in unrestricted. I was tempted. It wasn't so much the politics of it, but I felt for the people who've been displaced for so long. Some of them didn't have toothbrushes, as you can imagine, among other things. So, fortunately, I listened to the pros, and we did not let everybody back into Mountain Shadows. And then that afternoon, the fire was getting worse, coming back our way slowly. And we had a 4 o'clock briefing up at Coronado High School, you may remember. And it was pretty dark to the west, pretty black. And Rich Harvey, who was incredible National Command Authority director, was speaking to the media and facing east, and he had a map behind him. And I was standing right next to him. I was the next to speak. And he turned around to point to the map on the progression of the fire, and his mouth literally dropped open. So I turned around, and it was like some supernatural force had unleashed the most incredible flamethrower you can imagine down on Mountain Shadows. Our firefighters didn't have a chance. Our city limits were right at the top of Mountain Shadows. And I should tell you that based on Colorado law going back to 1800s, we are not allowed to go outside of our city without permission. And we didn't get permission from the county. So we were in the city ready to stop what we thought would be maybe a slow-moving fire. It came in here like a blowtorch. What we learned later was there was a cold front coming down the Front Range, 60-mile-an-hour wind. Nobody predicted it. It's one of those freaks of nature, but it grabbed that fire and it threw it right down into Mountain Shadows.
It's been 10 years but I can see it, the emotion as you're talking about it. Does it still feel like it was yesterday?
Sure. And I was told we probably lost hundreds of people. Yeah. So, and I felt personally guilty and responsible for that. And I was taken to task by folks for not evacuating the balance of Mountain Shadows and Peregrine and so forth earlier. I was told I didn't need to. Nobody thought we needed to. It's just one of those things happened. But I have to tell you, we lost 2 precious lives, which is a tragedy. We could have lost so many more, and it's really, I think, a testament to all the people that we evacuated. Was it 25,000 people in 2 hours? Mm-hmm. I was on the interstate stuck in traffic right at the Rock Rimmon exit out here, and I saw those lines of cars, and it was chaotic, and it was touch and go there for a while, getting people out of the affected areas, but people were so gracious. Stoplights weren't working. Anybody could have barged ahead. People stopped, let the next person in. It was amazing, the grace that people showed in that instance.
And Cindy, you were in the room for a lot of these decisions, conversations, and then on top of that, this became an international news story. So you had to help coordinate communication, not just with our local media, but folks around the world. What do you remember? And tell me what you remember from this event from 10 years ago.
Well, Patrick, you're right. This was the first time that I could remember having a story that generated international media interest. And we had reporters from France and Italy and Mexico, and everybody, had questions. We held press conferences every day at 8 and 4, mm-hmm. and the mayor was well prepared. We had a great leader by the name of Jerry Marr, who was helping lead the press conferences. But as Mayor mentioned before, Rich Harvey was just tremendous in his communication with the media, outlining all of the details for media members and members of the public who showed up. Because not only did we have members of the media, but there were lots of people who lived in Mountain Shadows who would show up for those press briefings every day, to learn what was going on. And this was the first time, the city of Colorado Springs had experienced anything like this. And all of the people in city government, this was all brand new. And I will tell you, grace is the word, because the people who lived in Mountain Shadows, these are people who, were looking at losing their homes, losing everything. And we couldn't imagine that. And so these people are experiencing everything from shock to sorrow, all sorts of sadness. So the media coverage, what we wanted mostly to do, our local media, all pros and so great to work with, but there were a lot of people outside of the market. This isn't their hometown. They were hopping fences, they were trying to get the story, and we were, trying to keep people at bay, explaining to them that please be respectful, because these people are in a horrible situation right now.
And with your background and experience in local news, I know for those of us who were here contributing to trying to help during that time, working in these local news arenas, this was an event that will stick with us for the rest of our careers. What do you think this did to express to the community the significance of local news when we have a disaster, especially one of this nature and size?
It was huge. I think when a community goes through an experience like this with their local media, they learn very quickly that these are the people who they are going to look to, the people they're going to trust, because you all know the landscape, you know the community, you know who the decision makers are. And that makes a big difference in national media. Unfortunately, people will still open the door to national and international media, but I think a lot of the decision makers, elected officials, many people had greater appreciation for our local media after that event.
Well, if I could add something, there was a couple in New York City who saw their home burning down on CNN. There was an unnamed Denver TV station that flew a helicopter over, despite the request by the governor, who was great, by the way. Governor Hickenlooper was big help to us. So we had media from elsewhere that just didn't have any respect for what was going on. You all in the local media were great. Everything you did was responsible and helpful, and we're very fortunate for that.
You guys had a lot of different things that you had to balance. You were spinning a lot of plates as this was happening. Split-second decisions. Tell me about when you realized, Mayor Bach, this was shifting from a active wildfire disaster to now a recovery effort, because I know you did a lot to coordinate the response and try to get all the players together to try to streamline this recovery effort, because so many people were impacted. So tell me about that kind of shift in mindset and why you believe we needed to act so quickly.
Well, a couple remembrances or perspectives there. Number one is we found out soon after that day that our addresses that the city had for all the residents did not match the county's addresses, that did not match the post office. And this was a very hot fire. It burned up everything in its path, including markings on curbs. So people that had painted their address on a curb, we couldn't find that. Folks were frustrated not being able to get back in after the fire because we had to hold them off longer, because I was told by the law enforcement people we thought we had perhaps a large number of deceased people. That's a crime scene, not knowing who started that fire. And so we had to get dogs up in there, cadaver dogs. We had to get teams of people on their knees, hands and knees. We had gas lines that had ruptured, so that was a big risk. And so I remember Cindy coming and saying to me, we need to tell people whether or not they have a home standing, but we got to make sure we have the addresses right. Do you remember that, Cindy? I mean, it was, and Laura Newman, our chief of staff, was at the center of that with Cindy, and both did an incredible job of sorting all that through.
How would you describe the destruction you saw? Because I know I couldn't believe it when I first saw it.
Well, it was like something you can't imagine. It was like out of a movie. I have to tell you that once we started letting people back in just briefly to check on their property, let me back up just for a second. That 26th, that Tuesday afternoon, I don't know what time it was. It might have been 6 p.m. by then, and we're still getting together and as a leadership team and planning to go up as far as we could in the mountain shadows just to see what's going on. And governor came down and we stopped at 30th and Garden of Gods, and we stopped there per the fire department's request. But I asked the fire chief, Rich Brown, I said, what do you think we got here? He said, we think we've lost hundreds of people and hundreds of homes, if not more. So I was expecting the worst. Fortunately, on the human side, it was far short of that, but on the property side, it was just incredible. And I remember going up there now, getting to a day or whatever, maybe a day and a half after the fire, and we had the whole place cordoned off. You couldn't get in there, but I was taken up there by the police and fire people, and we let people back in for a short time to check on their property. And I came upon this woman on her driveway sitting down weeping, and she was a single home buyer, first time she'd ever been able to buy a house, and she just closed 3 weeks before. And then went further, and it was a couple who had built their dream home a couple years before. And it was just a foundation and basically ash. But those people, those three people and so many others that I met, despite their grief, showed incredible, I think, resiliency and just strength. And certainly were the nicest people to me. I expected something different. But so it showed me a side of humanity that I'd never had a chance to experience.
So you've got all these folks that are just in shock, but at a certain point, you have to help them turn the corner to be able to start trying to figure out, where do we go from here? Yeah. Or how do we rebuild? Do we want to, they have to make some big decisions while they're still grieving what just happened. How do you approach that? What did you do from there?
Well, a couple things. Number one is, the day after the fire, I asked our emergency management staff, what's our plan for helping people recover from this? Well, we have a plan for rebuilding public infrastructure, streets, curb and gutter, utilities, and so forth, but we really don't have anything with respect to rebuilding lives. So I called a longtime friend of mine, Bob Cutter, retired high-tech CEO here in Colorado Springs, and who I trusted implicitly, and asked him to have lunch with me. I think that was either Wednesday or Thursday, a day or two after the fire. I said, Bob, we got to figure something out here. We don't have a plan here. We're going to have to help these people. And he actually had some great ideas. on how to marshal resources to help people. And I looked at them and I said, first of all, I'm buying lunch. Like, elected officials not supposed to take money from people, but besides, I had a hidden agenda, which is I said, I'm buying lunch and you're gonna do this and the city's gonna get out of the way. And honestly, I think the best thing we did was get out of the way in the sense that we empowered people in the private sector and volunteers to marshal forward, and we supported every way we could.
And I believe it was called Colorado Springs Together.
Yes,
that was the big
that's
thing.
right.
Tell me about what that was, and looking back, that's got to be a point of pride. There's so much sadness and heartache over what happened here, but how do you feel about just getting the players in the same room and establishing that?
They did it. I mean, they did it all. I just basically had lunch with Bob Cutter. I think it cost me $26.40, as I remember. And he'll pay me back someday, probably, but kidding. But no, I just said, get people together that you think can help. He brought in a retired insurance executive that knew all the ins and outs of insurance. He brought in financial people. He brought in all kinds of construction people. And it blossomed from there. I don't know the total number of volunteers they had in Colorado Springs Forward, but it was a lot of people. And Federal Credit Union offered the space that they had in Mountain Shadows that they were no longer occupying. So that became the headquarters for Colorado Springs Forward. It wasn't just a place to sit down and get help with insurance or all the other things. Where am I going to live for a while? What am I going to do? All those things that are needed, but also a place to connect with people. They had couches. I don't know if they had any psychologists there, maybe, but it was an incredible helping community endeavor. And then businesses started coming forward and saying, we want to help. Whoever rebuilds, we want to give them a big discount on this or that. I also have to say other communities like Mark Snyder of Manitou Springs, the mayor at that time, was incredibly helpful. So was Travis Easton of Monument and all the other mayors around here and all the first responders, of course. But it was the citizens that came together, and I think this really made that happen.
And Cindy, what do you recall from kind of that recovery effort, how the community came together? Mayor Bach laid it out about how there were so many folks, but what sticks out to you? What do you remember about what happened?
So Mayor Bach isn't going to take any credit, but without the really smart coordination of calling Bob Cutter and putting Colorado Springs together, that was a game changer. We have had communities call on Bob Cutter and others to ask about how we went about putting that together, we meaning the city of Colorado Springs, because when a community experiences a wildfire, it's difficult and you've never done it before. What do we do? Where do we go? And so the mayor's right about, he got the right guy in the right place, and Cutter hired, or rather recruited a lot of really smart volunteers, and it was like a machine. And people had somewhere to go. They had someone to connect with. And oftentimes, when communities experience, a natural disaster, a wildfire, people are going in all different directions. So Mayor Bach deserves a lot of credit. I don't know what we would have done without his leadership. He will be humble, and when we walk out of here, he'll probably give me the business, but it was remarkable to just watch him in action. He remained calm. He delegated, he dispatched, and made so many smart moves, and that's why there were so many people who rebuilt in Mountain Shadows. And it didn't stop there.
Well, thank you, Cindy. We could go all afternoon on all the people that made such a great contribution. Colorado Springs Utilities expedited getting the gas service back on. They initially thought it could take maybe 6 or 9 months. And honestly, we said that's not going to work. If we have to, we're calling Xcel Energy. Well, they did, I think. They called somebody and got help, to their credit. Regional building was terrific in expediting permits. Even the fire marshal, who can be somewhat of a crusty guy like I am. Well, Brett Lacey needs to be that way in many occasions, but he was reasonable in terms of what he required on rebuilding, for example. And so I can go on and on.
Yeah.
The county was great. All the other partners were great, but it was the people in Mountain Shadows that made the difference. And they never gave up. They never wavered. And I just can't compliment them enough.
And Cindy, just to go back to you for a minute, in these years following, you've seen people in need in our community. You've seen how people rally behind and will give, and you've seen the real kind of fundraising effort. Looking back now, What do you kind of make of how our community, people that maybe weren't directly impacted by the fire, but this was part of their community that was hurting, what do you remember about just the heart of Colorado Springs and even surrounding areas like Mayor Bach had mentioned, and how they responded?
Well, it was so touching. The mayor mentioned Coronado High School, where we staged those first few days. And there were people showing up with everything from packs of water to, no kidding, plates of lasagna. Just, they wanted to do something. And so what ended up happening was El Pomar gave United Way seed money to start a fund. And there was a fund that raised nearly $1 million for the nonprofits who were serving all of the people who had been affected by the fire. And that is a tremendous amount of money in a short period of time. But again, points to the generosity and heart that this community has, and they don't let people down. I will also say that I didn't mention this earlier. When it came to local media, people were glued to their television sets. And you guys were, carrying, the fire 24/7. I mean, it's what people were doing. And this community relied on local media, and you all delivered. You stepped up and you were there. And that, people just want to know what's going on. They need the information. So that was, I know, a very expensive venture for all of the local media, and cost local media a lot of money, and it was worth it because people relied on you.
And Mayor Bach, when you hear, those fundraising totals, when you have that much money, I'm sure a big priority is trying to make sure this money gets in the hands of people who actually need it. How big of a priority was that, and what do you know about what transpired back then?
Well, the top priority. And again, we got the bureaucracy, including myself, I'm part of it, out of the way. We said, we're going to be here to support you all every way you need us. But you run with this, and I'm pretty sure Colorado Springs Forward had a lot to say about how that money was spent, along with the nonprofits. I'd like to go back to that Thursday night for a minute. Tuesday, the fire rained down on us. At 4 o'clock, I didn't say this, but it was my turn to talk next. And fortunately, our emergency management people came up to my side and said, announced that we're evacuating the balance of mountain shadows and everything north right now. So, okay. So I said that. And you all asked me, are you saying everyone wants to buy 25? And I said, yes. That was instrumental. If your KOAA and your partners in the media in town hadn't been on the ball there and made sure that was clear to understood, I'm not sure everybody would have gotten out. Mm-hmm. So that's really important. 2 days later, we had a meeting at UCCS. They were nice enough to open up their big auditorium, and everybody from Mountain Shadows was invited to come and find out the status of their home, which is pretty tough duty. So all of the senior staff, I asked Cindy and all of our senior staff, fire chief, police chief, chief of staff, deputy, fire chief, and so forth, to each take one of the rooms. For example, if you lived in a certain group of addresses, you should go in this room and so forth. None of us had any training in grief management or how to deal with high stress environments like that. I was so proud of our people, the way they handled themselves, but I'm also remembering the people who attended. My wife Susie and I were there, of course, and we tried to move around some. I remember in a hallway, and this woman came toward us. I don't know how old she was, I'd say middle-aged. And she walked up to us, and I was ready to take both barrels, which would have been fair, with all the high emotions. She says, I just want to tell you something. She said, I've lost everything, but I've got myself, and I got my dog, and my family, and my friends, and I am a blessed person. I thought that is the most amazing, amazing story. She'd lost everything, but she had that support network and a bigger support network, and you ask about people in the community, I got hundreds of phone calls a day. People all around this town, everywhere, all around the region, want to know what they could do. And certainly business people, but just regular residents wanting to do whatever they could. I think it was I've lived here a long time, over half a century. You wouldn't know about that, but I have.
We don't have to go into that,
well,
but yes,
half
right.
a century ago, this was a small town. Anyway, I've lived here a long time. And in my experience, that was the pinnacle of our community spirit. And I said at that time, boy, I wish we could bottle this. And by the way, I want to say, city council was great to me. I had the authority to do whatever I had to do as an executive, but they could have meddled, they could have grandstanding. They could have gotten away. They didn't do any of that. I was so appreciative of our city council at that time.
So thank you both, for sitting down and rehashing this again. I think we could go a week, probably talking about all the memories now that we're digging down into them. But I just kind of want to wrap up just with a couple of things. So Cindy, I'll start with you. Is there something that you remember most? Like if you look back, is there something that rises, to the top for you? We're obviously doing this special. We're looking back 10 years. Is there one memory that really sticks out to you?
Probably a couple, and that was seeing Steve Riker, who worked for Colorado Springs Fire Department, really in the, I think it was after Governor Hickenlooper arrived, and we went down just to find out the status of the fire, and seeing him and the courage that he displayed and knowing how brave all of those firefighters were. It hits you because you're so close to it and you have a much better understanding and respect for what they do. So that's one of the things. We did not touch on the mayor's visits to all of the people who rebuilt their homes afterwards. And he decided that when people started rebuilding that he would go to every home that he could and take a loaf of bread, a package of salt, and a bottle of wine to welcome people back to their homes. And he took Susie, and he would have different guests with him, and they wrote a little card to the folks, and that meant a lot to people. But he went to all of the people who had rebuilt, and that was important because there were so many people who had rebuilt, and these were people who had been through so much, lost everything, and they have the mayor knocking on the door to come and visit, maybe stay for dinner, I don't know. But
our community, we have so many people coming and going at any given time. Why do you think it's important for us to reflect on this and look back? You can go to the Pioneers Museum, you can see everything that unfolded there, in the archives. But why do you think it's important for us to give this some airtime, and why is this an important anniversary to you?
It changed our community and how we interacted with each other, I believe. People, after we went through this together, heightened respect for first responders, for firefighters, for elected officials. We have a pretty unique community, and people don't find that out until they start having conversations with decision makers and elected officials in other cities. And they will remark on, the ability to just work together. That doesn't happen in a lot of communities. And we still have, there's strife and disagreement, but I think people, the respect level is different, and the care and concern for neighbors is different. And the people who went through that all together, they're bonded in a way, and that won't ever change. That will stay with them.
Mayor Bach, why is this an important anniversary to you? We've already seen the emotion from you when you recall what was going through your mind, the emotions in the moment. 10 years later, we're looking back. Why is it important to look back?
That experience showed the heart and soul of the people who live here 10 years ago. And still, I believe today, it's important today, I think, and where we should focus right now, is on paying tribute to the people of Mountain Shadows, above everybody else, above all else, what they endured, what they went through, what they lost, the strength, the courage, the resiliency, the grace, and even the people that weren't damaged, how they came to help their neighbor. I saw so many examples of that. And so I just think it's important not only to remember what happened, but to appreciate people that live here. And I have to say, we're still at risk here. A lot of those fires started because embers got up through the grill on the outside of the roof, up into the attics, or caught the drapes on fire, things like that. So we need to be diligent, but I think on this special time, let's pay tribute to the people of Mountain Shadows.
We have the benefit of 10 years of hindsight now. This is probably the toughest question I'm going to ask you here.
Yeah.
Is there anything you would have done differently, or you think as a community, as a city, that maybe we should have done differently when this fire
I'd make Cutter
happened?
pay for lunch. No. Honestly, other than myself, I could have communicated, I think, better in some ways as we went along. But in terms of everything else, I don't want to compare us to anybody else, but we did it the right way. Now, we had one jurisdiction to deal with, which was Colorado Springs. We didn't have multiple ones like up the interstate here, which is much more complicated. But everybody, I mentioned City Council, all the other entities worked together. Nobody was trying to grandstand or take control or have the power. It was, okay, can I help? If I can, I'll raise my hand. So I honestly don't find anything other than our preparedness that needs to get better.
So I'll let you have this final question, and it's similar to the one that I asked Cindy. 10 years, looking back, you had so many moments, so many interactions that you shared with us during this interview. Is there anything that rises to the top level when you think back, your most fond or most vivid, maybe memory, maybe not fond, but vivid memory from this fire?
Well, the woman who had lost her first home was weeping on her driveway that day all by herself. We had a chance to go back to her new home after it was rebuilt. I wasn't sure what to expect because the first time I met her, I won't tell you what she said to me. It was unvarnished. She was extremely emotional. I don't blame her. And it was fine. But when I went back there, you would have thought I was her dearest relative. She was so happy to be back at home, and all the people who helped her get there deserve a lot of credit.
Well, I can tell you guys both, as someone who was working on some of this professionally at the time, but also someone who was a resident of Colorado Springs when this all unfolded, working with you guys directly throughout this, I just want to echo from my fellow media colleagues and also folks that I heard from in the community, thank you for the important work that you guys did, and thank you for revisiting this, because I know it's not always easy to look back at the loss and what happened, but thank you both for the grace and for sitting down and going over this with me.
Happy